Hello, my name is Rich Howard, owner of Architectural Builder Supply, and this video is to bring you a closer look at the best. This is their part number 1E74C181 RP5 622. This is a mortise cylinder housing is what it is. Very common mortise cylinder housing, no question, in terms of its length, in terms of its cam, obviously small format, and even the size, the 1.25" body length is very common. The only thing slightly less common would be the fact that it's in a 622 finish, which is black, but it's 2020 now, and black has been fairly popular for the last couple of years. Right off the bat, I want to talk about how Best classifies the length of their cylinders. This is an 1.25" cylinder. It's the standard length for their 7-pin cylinder. 1.25", right? Well, we've all been trained since we started in this industry that cylinders are measured from the underside of the head to the back of the cam. You'll see that this is clearly, it's closer to 1 7/16 if anything. Best measures these from the underside of the head to the back of the body is how this is measured. So be mindful. Confusion exists. Mistakes have happened. I recently had a supplier of mine, I asked for the Best 1E74, a 1E7 with a 24 length. 24 is code for 1.5". Well, this is what they sent. And, it's not 1.5". You can't call it 1.5". The person entering the order didn't understand, well, Best has this unique way of doing it. And that's just how they do it. And because, basically Best measures their cylinders different than everyone else that I've ever heard of. Sargent, Corbin, Medico, Schlage, Yale, on and on. Imports, clones. Everybody else measures them differently. So if I ordered an 1.25" cylinder, this is an 1.25" cylinder, a 1E74 is 1.25", but again, doesn't include the cam. If I ordered an 1.25" cylinder from anyone else, it's going to measure an 1.25" overall length, including the cam. So let's do a little deeper dive and find out exactly why Best does that. So a quick note, the next section of this video is admittedly a detour when talking about this Best cylinder. The next 27 minutes of this video are going to be a deep dive into the theory and logic as to why mortise cylinders are measured the way they are and why it's important. So if you don't want to spend that time going over that, fast forward about 27 minutes. And thank you very much. Hello, my name is Rich Howard, owner of Architectural Builder Supply, and this video is to continue the conversation regarding how to measure a mortise cylinder. And the conversation is simply stated, as I did in a much earlier prior video, that the length of a mortise cylinder is measured from the underside of the head to the back of the cam. That's the dimension. I happen to have a mortise cylinder here. This happens to be a Schlage 80-103, which is a small format interchangeable core housing only in a mortise cylinder format. It has a Adams Wright style cam on the back and would be very typical, obviously, for use in an aluminum storefront. Why is this cylinder being used as an example? No reason. It's a mortise cylinder. That's all. All we need is a mortise cylinder that we can measure from the underside of the head to the back of the cam. The 80-103 is listed as 1 3/8". That's the length of the cylinder. Underside of the cam, underside of the head to the back of the cam is 1 3/8". Okay. Now, why is that the length that it is called out as? Is a question that is worthy of scrutiny or further study. However, before we get there, it's important to note that not every manufacturer measures the cylinders in that fashion. Best, for instance, does not measure them, the overall length of the cylinder, from the underside of the head to the back of the cam. This is a 1E74 cylinder, which is like most common mortise cylinder housing probably of all time from Best. It's a 7-pin cylinder that will take a 7-pin. It'll take a 5 or a 6-pin either, but it's meant for 7-pin. And it is the 1E74. If you looked it up in their book, they're going to tell you it's 1.25 inches. 1.25 inches. Well, where's the underside of the head to the back of the cam? It's quite clearly 1 3/8. In fact, it's slightly heavier than that. But if you study the length of the brass body itself, underside of the head to the back of the brass body, that's 1.25 inches. That's their dimension A. So be mindful that for reasons that are yet to be discovered, Best doesn't measure it that way. I've spoken to Best about this, and their answer is we don't know why we do it this way. It would be my guess that the folks at Best who are exceptional when it comes to technical support, in terms of expertise, responsiveness, you name it, they're exceptional. It could be that it's been done this way for a half of a century, and that's the way it's done. It would make sense to me. You could certainly argue, something like, well, yeah, I mean, it's our 1E74. That's 1.25 inch cylinder. Maybe it's got something to do with manufacturing. So the people in the manufacturing plant know how long to cut their brass stock before it's machined. Someone has to do the calculation. So if this cylinder is really meant to be 1 3/8, but they call it 1.25 inches, do the people that are cutting the brass to make this care about the length, including the cam? They don't. They want to know how long to cut their pieces. So it could be that as well. I can't think of a reason as it relates to hardware to call it the length of the body only, because what we will discover, I think it can be successfully argued that the overall length of the cylinder is actually more important. The underside of the head to where the back of the cam, as this cylinder relates to the universe that it exists in, meaning not on its own, it's more important to probably know that dimension. Now, if you're talking about this standalone on its own, not relating to any hardware, we can call it anything you want, because we have to call it something. And I might argue that calling it 1.25 inches is really more important, because that's the length of the cylinder. If I'm going to add something onto it, such as a cam, that changes its overall length. Or if I change the shape of the head, let's say if I came up with a giant tapered head or some unusual head thickness, does that change the overall length? No, not at all. Of course it does. What I was trying to say was, does it change the length of the cylinder, underside of the head to the back of the body or the back of the cam? Not at all. Does that change it at all? So what we extend to the back side or what we do to the front side doesn't really change the fact that we're dealing with an 1.25 inch cylinder. But I argue that when you take this and then you force this to play nice with other pieces of hardware, like a mortise lock body, whether it be a mortise lock or an exit device or aluminum storefront or exit device trim, or you're using it as a key bypass on an alarm shutoff, like a single pole double throw key switch. As soon as you say, okay, now I want you to work inside of this greater assembly, now we need to talk about, okay, what is the operating length? And the logic from Best, because they're the only one that I know of that measures it in that fashion. So I suppose what I'm trying to say is, without fully understanding the logic of why one manufacturer does it one way and the rest of the industry that I'm aware of does it a different way, it is okay for us as hardware experts, as people who involve ourselves with hardware, because we just have to understand what the definition is and then calculate accordingly. And it's not a coincidence that I selected these two cylinders, because they are the same cylinder by two different manufacturers. They just happen to call it different sizes. The Best catalog says this is 1.25 inches. The Schlage catalog says this is 1 3/8. They are the same length, even though they're a little different, but not. I mean, let's get technical. Let's actually measure the length of the body of each. Okay, the Best body is 1.272. 1.272. The Schlage body is 1.269. Okay? 1.272, so 3/1000ths of an inch. It's there for all intents and purposes. These are the same cylinder, the same cam, and the same small format is what they are. So I asked a cross-section of the industry, people who are experts. And when I say experts, I actually call these people the most famous people that no one has ever heard of. And that is meant to say that there are giants within our industry, and these people that I have communicated to have been classified by a giant in the industry as giants of the industry. People that I've asked the question, hey, I've been thinking about why do we measure it this way, and why has it been done this way? And they have all contributed responses to that, and I want to share those responses with you now, just so that we can have an understanding better of why cylinders are measured this way. And I've thought about it myself. And when it comes to defending the best position, having a background in manufacturing, to the people in the back that are actually cutting the material, they don't care what the length is with the cam. They don't need to. Not that they don't care. It's not germane to what they're doing. Okay. Giving that data to the shop and such, to the plant who's programming a machine or using a compound radial bandsaw, we've got to tell them something. So do you want to tell them, cut it to this size? I need it this size when you're done, or I need it this size to include the cam. You figure it out. And in my experience, not that you don't want calculations being done in the shop, but you need to distill the data to go to the shop in such a way that is like, here's what I need. Make me 400 of these. Make them all 1.25 inches. Not make them not make them 1 3/8 inches, deduct the thickness of the cam. What's the cam? What's the thickness of the cam? I don't know. What am I subtracting? What do I really cut it to? So defending best. The other side of the coin, though, however, and I believe while the industry does it the way that it is done, is because these don't exist on their own. On its own, it has no importance to us. But when you toss it into a mortise lock or a trim or a key alarm bypass, now it's important to know how it interacts. The way that I do it is I'll take a mortise lock body. When I'm calculating the length of the cylinder that I need, if we're understanding it as the underside of the head to the back of the cam, I'll take my door thickness, assuming that I'm putting the lock in the center of the thickness of the door, which don't assume that you are, because you aren't always doing that. And a reason that you're not is, imagine that you have 1 3/4 thick doors, and then your client on the pull side is laying 1-inch fabric panel everywhere. And that door is going to kind of disappear into the wall to a certain extent. So your lock body is now not centered in the 2 3/4. You've got 1 3/4 door and a 1-inch panel, but that cylinder needs to come through. So your lock body is no longer centered. I've also done projects for people where they were building 3-inch thick gates for the High Line in New York, the reclaimed space, elevated train areas, gates, where they had 3-inch thick gates, and they weren't centering the lock body in the bottom of that 3-inch steel tube because of the way that the bolt would interact with what the condition was at the sill. So understanding the door thickness is important, but that's based on, is the lock in the center of the thickness of the door? Don't assume that it is, because it may not be. But if it is centered in the thickness of the door like it usually is, I take the door thickness and I cut that in half. So 1 3/4 divided by 2 is going to, of course, be 7/8 of an inch. And at that point, I just, of course, said 7/8 of an inch, and that's important to note, that not every door is actually 1 3/4. And I don't want to really derail, but if you take your caliper and you put it on a fire-rated wood door, it's 1.71 or something like that. It's not 1.75. If you take a 14 gauge steel stiffened hollow metal door and you put your caliper on it, it's not 1.75 inches. It's going to be 1.875. So when you're dealing with standard doors, standard hollow metal, standard architectural wood doors, 1.75 I think is good. But when you are dealing with a door that you say to yourself, wow, that's a cool door, maybe put the caliper on it, because that calculation could change what you will order your cylinder at. So 1.75 inches divided by 2 is 7/8. Okay, so my cam needs to come to 7/8 to be in the center of the door, but I usually will shave it back 1/16 or 1/8 of an inch because of the possibility of doing this. Double cylinder aluminum storefront, which is not really common, but I want to be able to have a small margin between my two cams so that they operate. No more than 1/8 of an inch, no less than 1/16 is my rule of thumb. So now you know the thickness of the door, you're centering it, cut that in half, 7/8, take off 1/16. Okay, so you're really dealing with a 13/16 cylinder, quite short. Then you're going to add whatever you're installing that through. Cylinder collar, cylinder ring, escutcheon trim. It's sitting into an exit device trim. It is an alarm bypass where there's going to be a collar. At that point, you say to yourself, okay, how much longer does my 13/16 now have to grow because of what I'm sticking it through? How thick is that? Add that dimension. And if you get to a point where you're like, okay, well, I'm at 1.125 well, in the case of Schlage, I think they include a 7/16 blocking ring. So let's just say I'm at 1.116 and Schlage is packing this with a 7/16 blocking ring. Why? Because it's 1 3/8. Why? Because that's the shortest they make this in. Why? Because of what you're sticking into it. So for an 1 3/4 thick door, it's very likely you're going to need a 7/16 blocking ring, because you can't get a 7-pin compatible shorter than 1 3/8 because the cylinder itself is too long to fit into anything shorter than that. And I do understand from one of our giants of the industry that it's a downside with best, because some people don't like how long their cylinders are. Understood. I don't either. You're adding lots of blocking rings. Why? Because you have a 7-pin interchangeable, small format interchangeable core system installed. So that calculation of how long your cylinder needs to be is done when you're putting this in context of the rest of the things it needs to work with. The lock, the door thickness, how thick you're sticking it through, okay? And the function of the lock, what will potentially come in contact with this, that's all going to conspire to say how thick you need something to be. Now, in the best example, what's the one piece of information I'm missing? I'm missing the thickness of the cam, which is about 1.3 inch, just heavy on 1/8 of an inch. But if you use that logic and you're saying 1 1/4 for best, does that really get you to where you need to be to understand this cylinder in its greater context? I'm going to argue that no, it doesn't, because if you're thinking that it's 1 3/4 and you have a double cylinder application and you're calculating your thickness of your trim rings based on what you're sticking it through, a cylinder collar, a ring, a trim, a rose, an escutcheon, whatever, I don't know that it's the shortest path to get to where you need to be to order your length of your mortise cylinders. I don't think that there's any excuse to not being able to calculate that, because, you know, if that's 0.13 inch on thickness of the cam, you can calculate that, because you're still coming to those two, you know, a cylinder being in the center of the lock and then shaving it back a little bit. So let me read to you 3 answers that I've received, giants of the industry. And I'll tell you this, as a commercial, as a advertisement, the Door Hardware Institute and ALOA, ALOA.org. I want to make sure that that's correct. I know it is. ALOA.org is definitely what it is. It is the national organization as it pertains to the locksmithing industry. And there are lots of people, by the way, the Associated Locksmiths of America is what it stands for. A lot of people are in the locksmithing business. There are franchises of locksmithing businesses, and many people call themselves locksmiths. There are people who have written textbooks on locksmithing, and it does not appear that they hold an industry credential that would be assigned by a LOA, like a CML, Certified Master Locksmith. So you have people who are locksmiths but don't participate and might be at the beginning of their career. And then you have people who write textbooks who may not participate. I don't know that, but don't have the credential. So I'm thinking, well, if they're going to possess the knowledge, why not get the credential? And then the Door Hardware Institute, of which I participate in both. The relationships that you forge through these two organizations are the very exact reason why there are people that I can tap their shoulder and say, excuse me, would you please give me your opinion or educate me, teach me about how this works. And without ALOA and DHI, there would be no access to these folks. You would never know of them because they're the most famous people no one has ever heard of. So possibly the largest manufacturer of cylinders in North America, in the United States anyway, has said, and there's kind of two parts to this. The operating parameter of the cylinder can't include the head because it bottoms out on the cylinder or trim and is not part of the penetration of the cylinder into the lock. So what this gentleman is saying is, don't include the head. It doesn't come into play. It really doesn't, whether it be a weird tapered head or square head, whatever you've got. Now here's the meat of it. The cam is included because it is inside of the operating parameter of the cylinder. Pardon me. The cam is included because it is inside of the operating parameter of the length. In other words, the depth at which the cylinder penetrates a lock has to include the cam to judge that the cam operates in the sweet spot of the mortise lock or approximately in the middle of the throw lever that operates the bolt. So the throw lever is the yoke that the cam will come through and kick back and forth to lock and unlock your unit. So what they're saying is, what he's saying is, I need to know the cam because that's part of the totality of what the job is the cylinder's doing. I need to know where that is. Yeah, and yes, I think we can all say that that's correct. A gentleman who is a giant in the industry, he is the head, I believe the head technical person at a manufacturer of locks that has been in business for decades, and they're known to be the company who, when no one else can make it, these folks can probably make it. And in fact, I've had this company make me 2 mortise locks maybe 10 years ago that were to operate the access to the air traffic control tower at the international airport in Qatar in the Middle East. These locks had to have 2 keys for access. So like a setup key and then an operating key, like you would have in a safe deposit box. But you've seen it in the movies. You need 2 keys to arm the missiles. These locks required 2 keys to gain access. This company could make them. So this gentleman says, I think to select the right cylinder length that integrates with the hardware, takes into account the door thickness. The most important things is to know how far the end of the cam engages into the lock and where the cylinder head will be in relation to either the hardware it sits on or the door itself if you're not using a collar. The end of the cam to the underside of the cylinder head gives you that information so that you can calculate based on the rest of the inputs. It is also the opinion of this gentleman that it is true, Best has not manufactured commercial hardware for as long as Schlage or certainly Yale and Corbin and Sargent. By comparison to Sargent, Corbin, Russwin, and Yale, Best is a newcomer in the industry of manufacturing hardware. And in fact, I believe that they had, don't quote me, but maybe Falcon made locks for them, and they had an agreement, but eventually they got into lock manufacturing. And it's the supposition of this gentleman that maybe Best just didn't know. I would imagine that they probably knew, because like Frank Best himself, who patented the small format cylinder he came up with the idea in the early 19 teens. applied for patent in 1919 and was awarded the patent in 1921. When you look at the patent for the small format core, there's no chance that, in my opinion, he was not aware of everything else that existed in the industry, and in particular mastering by P.F. Corbin, because there's a similarity there based on the existence of ball bearings. So I would think that Best really knew what was going on, and I like the idea of them needing to qualify it as some size, and that they did it based on internal reasoning. The third answer that I have is from another giant of the industry who worked for, a company that's been manufacturing locks for, I think next year will be 100 years, and is responsible for technology that we all use every single day. And his answer is, the back of the flanged end of the mortise cylinder to the back of the cam is the dimension that you need for door thickness calculations. For example, to check that the cam reached the middle of the mortise lock, or that two mortise cylinders don't bump into each other in double cylinder applications, is why you want to know that. Basically what he's saying is, if you don't know that length, you can still calculate it, but you still need to know the length, the thickness of the mortise of the cam. And he goes on to say, I don't know why Best does it differently, but if I had to guess why, he would say that maybe perhaps they don't want to convey the actual length of the cylinder because it's considered an objection to certain folks. Hey, I want my 7-pin technology in small format interchangeable core, of which Best is the name synonymous with that, but I don't want the cylinder to be so long. We can't have both. You don't want the cylinder to be so long, get a thicker door. Okay? So, however that's going to be. So that's his supposition. And again, three giants of the industry that, are incredibly gracious with their answers and their time. And it's my involvement with, in this case, Aloha. Well, both really, both. But Aloha, when it comes to locksmithing stuff specifically, back to the commercial, you'll want to, in my opinion, be a member of Aloha. And take classes or be participating, because you will meet the most famous people no one has ever heard of. So that's the my 2020 take on how to measure a mortise cylinder. I think the only thing you have to be sure is of the lock that you're dealing with is the sweet spot, as one of the gentlemen said, the center of the lock. And I can't think of a lock where it's not, except, well, yeah, you kind of can. There are sweet spots. The center of a mortise lock, to throw the throw member to draw the latch or bolt. But if you have an alarm bypass and an exit device, there is a tailpiece, so to speak, that is coming off the micro switch, so that when you throw the key back and forth, you're either engaging that micro switch or you're not. So the length of the cylinder you really have to know, because the sweet spot does exist, which isn't the center of anything. The same with a surface-mounted alarm that will have a magnetic, sort of reed switch contact happening. You can only have so long of a mortise cylinder before it will bottom out to the back of the lock, and then you need to add trim rings to all of that. So knowing what the sweet spot is, as a term that one of these three gentlemen has coined for me, knowing where your sweet spot is important to know as well, because let's not assume we're just dealing with a grade 1 mortise lock where you can be in or out, 1/8 of an inch, and it's probably going to be okay. And as I've learned through DHI, and I've learned through life experience, whether or not I intended to know it, and it has been said to me by one of the instructors, a Canadian gentleman who works in Nova Scotia. His whole thing was, read the installation instructions. You're someone who works in the door hardware industry. Read the installation instructions. Study the templates. You want to take that to another level, go out in the back in the shop and learn how to prep doors. And then you're going to understand why things are important the way that they're important. If you have any questions on how to measure mortise cylinders, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. My name is Rich Howard, owner of Architectural Builder Supply, and to those giants of the industry, the most famous people no one has ever heard of, I deeply am grateful for my ability to be able to tap you on the shoulder. Thank you very much. Now that we've filled in the reasoning of the logic of the length of the cylinder, let's do a tour of the item. So this is and we're going to dissect the part number, but the visual tour. It's black. It's got that C181 cam on the back, and that's code for just an Adams Rite MS style cam. Adams Rite has 3 cams for their 3 different locks. Everything except the 2331 and the 4070 or 4770, I forget. Sliding door lock, some other lock, I forget, and then everything else. If you need what's referred to as an MS cam, maximum security is a Adams Rite trademark. You'd be looking at that cam riveted on. This is a 7-pin cylinder, which means it's going to include a spacer disc that you would toss down in there if you're using 6-pin cylinders. If you are using 5-pin cylinders, you'll need to buy one of these extra and put it down in there. Of 30 years of selling best, albeit, you know, in a somewhat part-time fashion, I suppose, I've never seen a 5-pin interchangeable core cylinder, although I know they exist. Also, what's included is a security or a set screw that's here. Now, this little set screw, on the side of the cylinder, you can see that there's been a hole drilled and it's tapped. So the way that this works, and we'll look at the installation instructions, is when you're going to install this into whatever you're installing it into, assuming that it has a set screw that's perpendicular, okay, to the body, mortise lock, regardless of the type of mortise lock, versus this being something that has a threaded nut on the back. You will install this into your lock, okay? You will then tighten your set screw, but then, before you do all that, you're going to take this screw and get it started down into that hole that's in there, and it's not super easy to get that down in there, but with a screwdriver, you can get it in there and then turn it and tip it down and start to thread it in. And you'll thread it to the point where it will poke out from the inside of the cylinder out. Once you have this installed into the lock, tighten that set screw on the side of the lock, then go in and tighten this set screw, and it helps prevent the cylinder from being wrenched off the door. Okay, so that's what that's for. You've got to get it tightened down enough so that your interchangeable core can go into the housing itself. So that's what that little doodad there is for. Okay, this is an RP5, which means you're going to get these 3 trim rings. And the best installation instructions say, if the best cylinder is longer than what you're replacing, use a trim ring. Use a couple of trim rings. Use them all. And the reason they'll need to include those is because housings for interchangeable core cylinders are always giving you the potential for them to be longer than what you're replacing. So if you're doing a 7-pin cylinder, the minimum length that could be is 1 1/4 inches. And if you're going into an aluminum storefront door, or automatic sliding doors with a removable, interchangeable core, small format interchangeable core, you're for sure going to need trim rings, guaranteed, because the actual requirement of the length of that cylinder, would be at the most 7/8. So with a 1-inch cylinder, there's still going to be a collar. Well, this is 1 1/4 inches the body length. Okay, so you're going to need a collar for sure. Now the dimension on these 3 collars, we'll quickly measure those. About 3/8 on the thickest one. About 1/4 on the middle size, and about 1/8 of an inch on the thinnest one. So 1/4, 3/8, 1/4, and 1/8. Forgive me, 3/8, 1/4, and 1/8. So you should be able to handle a lot of scenarios. These are just hollow rings, and they're tapered, which is really going to give you the ability to fill the distance potentially from the underside of the head to the face of the door. Although if it was me, I might want to use something that would be solid. I don't think that much would prevent me from crushing this down to get that wrench over this and get this wrenched down onto the cylinder head itself. I might be looking for something a bit more durable if I expected the potential for vandalism, an attempt at break-in, things of that nature. What else is included with the cylinder housing are the installation instructions. Best may be the only company who includes installation instructions with a cylinder housing. But knowing Best, there's likely a very good reason for it. Let's switch to the screen view and take a closer look at the supporting documentation. Okay, this is the item that we are looking at. We have a 1E74 C181 RP5 622. There are documents listed down below. This first one is going to be a product brochure. It's an overview of the entire series of E-series, the entire line of E-series mortise and rim cylinders. And we don't need to go very far to be able to start to dissect our part number and to see how they derive the part number. First, as we were talking earlier about the length, the 7-pin, 1E, 7 is 7-pin, 1.25 inches. That dimension line's not really good there, but when you measure a 1E74, the body length is 1.25 inches. So that's how we derive that. Door thickness, 1 7/8 to 2.5. Well, if I take my 1.25 inch cylinder and I add, all of my collars, 3/8 plus quarter plus eighth is going to be 3/4 inch. So I'll be able to, that door thickness range is flexible in the sense that the small side is flexible in that you add trim rings and you'll bring this down, most certainly. But that 2.5 inch. Now the 2.5 inch is a pretty solid number because your body length is 1.25 inches. So that times 2.5. I might say that that's closer to 2 5/8. When I install cylinders, I really want to go to the center of the thickness of the door, and then I will take like a 1/16 of an inch off of that and divide it by 2. And that would generally be my cylinder length, including the cam. Okay, so maybe a little flexibility on that. Also, actually, now to think of it, that's based on how you're installing the lock in the door, meaning is it centered in the thickness. If you have a door that's 1 3/4 thick, and then you're adding a 1-inch fabric panel to the ingress side of the opening, you can't center that lock in the thickness of the door. You're going to need to center it in the thickness. Well, excuse me. You won't center it in the thickness of the final thickness of your installation, your 2 3/4. You'll center it in the 1 3/4, and then you're going to need to add an inch to whatever cylinder length you would require. So, also depending on where you install that lock. The 7 will take all cores. The 6 will not take a 7-pin core. So it's quite common to just order 1E7s, but a 1E6 is going to be a shorter cylinder. And if you're running 6-pin lengths, 6-pin cores, then order the 1E64. Now, after that, we have our function code. Okay, page 12. Let's scroll down to page 12 and take a look at our codes. We have a 4 in that space. A 4 is just a standard mortise cylinder, as you can see. There is a list of fun cylinders here. Standard rim cylinder. A tapered mortise would be a 6, and that's literally going to have a tapered head. A turn knob, 1EA. A square head mortise. I've never seen a square head mortise, but you get the idea. Lost motion. You might use that on, a deadbolt application. UL 437 here. A mogul cylinder, 1.5 inch diameter. So, well, let's back up. Don't use the term mogul. There are 4 sizes of cylinders. Peanut cylinders are 3/4 inch. Standard cylinders like this one is 1 5/32. A jumbo cylinder or a master ring cylinder is the 1.5" diameter. Mogul would be larger than that at 2 inch. Forgive me. A jumbo cylinder or master ring, they can do that as well. So interesting stuff here. So we've talked about the different functions. Let's go back to our how to order table. Length code, and this is where the confusion comes in. See page 4 to 5. There's a table, and here's the length code. So when I ordered a 24, my dimension A should become 1.5". You can see they get out to 6 inch. I have done very long cylinders in the past, and you just need to calculate the length of your cylinder and then order it appropriately. When you leave that field blank, you're going to get the 1.25" body length. Then your cam, we're doing a C181. Let's go to page 8 for the cams. Not every cam in the world that you could possibly need, I suppose, is here, but I can't think of any that are missing. Obviously, Schlage is going to be right here. C265 is Schlage. C181 is our good old Adams Rite. Okay, you're going to have your Corbin Russwin C161 right here. That's going to be used in other applications. What I mean to say is other lock manufacturers, like Accurate Lock, they'll use a C161 style cam in their lock bodies. This C118 might be Falcon. It's not listed here. So they're giving you dimensions, so you're going to want to confirm the manufacturer's catalog lock body for what cam they require dimensionally. All manufacturers will give you these dimensions, and you'll just cross-reference that. So you get the idea. Pick your cam. Yale is going to be a long, skinny cam. Might be the C210. That might be okay for Yale. I'd have to check the Yale catalog. The C4 is going to be the standard cam. Standard cam would be used in key switches, alarm bypass, mortise locks that are 100 years old would take a standard cam. Okay, you get the concept. Let's go back to our how to order table. Now we're in the rings. See page 9. RP rings. See page 9. Let's go to page 9. Sorry. Okay, I'm not seeing our RP rings, although there are collars that are here. Page 3 would be a better option for rings. RP, you're going to get this size and this size. When you order it, just as the standard package. You've got a 2, 3, 4, and 5 code on these rings. So when you study these different, ring packages, you can see you're going to have your dimensions quite covered. There's no price difference between RP, RP, RP3, RP5, but you want to make sure that you're going to get to where you need to be with the dimensions, because the RP standard will include a 3/16, a 16th fraction of a collar. So choose wisely on that, because you won't be able to get to a 16th of an inch with an RP5. So that's your ring package. And then, of course, your finish. 622 is not listed here. It's the new swanky finish that's being specified nowadays. Satin chrome, dark bronze, satin brass, satin bronze, oil rub bronze, satin nickel, polished brass, polished bronze, polished chrome, other finishes. And powder coating, that's 622. This has just been powder coated, is all it is. Really handy to be able to know how we build our part numbers together. So let's scroll through. Now, in the installation instructions, when we get to that, there's going to be a mention of the mortise cylinder wrench, and here it is. So you would insert this end into the mortise cylinder housing itself, to help you get it threaded into the door, through the door into the lock body. If you need help doing that. Some people will find getting their giant, fingers over this small head a bit of a chore. So having a wrench to get your hands on is a little bit easier. I find that I don't need the wrench. I don't have, unnaturally small nor large hands, so it works fine, and I prefer the tactile feedback to help ensure I'm not cross-threading anything, and I have a 30-year record going of not cross-threading anything. You would then turn the tool around and use this end to test the operation of the lock. Okay, so it's a dual-purpose tool. A couple of other tools here that I'll leave up to you to investigate. We talked about the length table. Here it is. We talked about different functions. Here are some of them. There's that tapered head. This same project that I'm doing now has these ADA compliant thumb turns. Client needed those. Dummy mortise, dummy rim cylinders. Dust covers can be done. UL 437. I don't know if they show us that here anywhere. There's that square head cylinder we talked about earlier. Cam locks, hotel function. Hotel function, that's going to basically, a hotel function cylinder is going to limit the degree of rotation of the standard operating key, where it will take a specialized key that will allow full turn on a cylinder so that you can throw or retract the deadbolt. So a hotel function acts that way, or they also call it a hotel function a display function or display key. You can look up the history of that. UL 437 cylinders are here. UL 437 is a reference to the UL listing that talks about what a cylinder will be subjected to and what it must pass if it wants to carry a UL rating, and it will have UL on it. So if your cylinder has UL on it, you have a UL listed cylinder. If you don't, then you do not. The UL 437 is going to talk to you about the attacks that are done, picking attacks, wrenching, drilling, forcing, how many minutes of each using tools. There's actually a document that is several pages long that defines the criteria for something to pass UL 437. Cormax is mentioned here as well, and other cylinder derivatives, cams, collars, and I'll leave the rest up to you to explore. The next link is the link to the installation instructions, which are included. We've kind of gone over it already. So step one, install the cylinder set screw. That's this. You're going to install it down through here. So a bit of a challenge, but you want to get that in and started. Or don't use it, which I know that some people don't use them, but I know many others that always use them. Why would you not use something that will give you additional security? It doesn't thread in the way that they're showing. It threads in from inside of here. Then get your cylinder installed. Before you thread it in, loosen your cylinder clamp screw if it's going into a mortise lock or whatever lock. Whatever's going to hold that cylinder in. Tighten that in. Use your rings, is what they're talking about here if it's too long. Tighten your screw once you get it installed. Tighten your set screw, belt and suspender approach to security. You want to be sure that your cam is in the correct location. You can insert like a number 3 slotted screwdriver down there if you need to rotate the cam so that the posts can enter into the back of the mortise lock, into the back of the cylinder itself. Using your control key, then you're done. A 15-degree counterclockwise rotation will set the cylinder in the housing, and then you remove the key from there. That's the installation instructions. Then we have our cut sheet. It's the same document. We just went over the entire product category. Below this video here is a link to the manufacturer's page. You click on that, and the entire manufacturer's page in our site from Best will come up. That will allow you to review not only all of the best products that we sell by means of this horizontal navigation, but also a link to the manufacturer's website, as well as a link to the full product catalog. And be mindful, That's not an insignificant document. That's 300 plus pages of everything best lock related. But also on this page will be encyclopedic documents over in this area. First of all, if you just starting at the top, if you wanted to see the Frank Best patent from 1921, he actually concocted this idea several years earlier, like maybe 1913, and it wasn't until 1919 where he applied for the patent on this lock. Very interesting concept when you study this. If you're a student of locksmithing, you're going to notice that his core pull position is the key pulled out one chamber location. You'll notice that there are bearings here, balls. Well, at that time, and 20 years before this, it was common, standard, that you would have ball bearings in cylinders because, and it was something that P.F. Corbin did, and I'm sure that Frank Best was very aware of what all lock manufacturers were doing. He probably took this idea from Corbin and used it because very low friction coefficient when you have a rotating ball, because the material science between the key itself and the tumblers were not the same. They would wear down their parts. German silver, or what we would call nickel silver, was not used everywhere. And as material science improved over the decades, the ball bearings went away. Obviously, today's small format interchangeable core doesn't operate on a single position of the key pull, but the concept of giving you the shear line here for key operation, here, and then pulling that out and giving you the shear line for the control lug here is the entire concept. Fascinating. Best Access Service Manual. This makes the catalog look tiny by comparison. This is a nearly 1,400 page document. I assure you that it's worth your time to look here first, because when you call Best and you ask a question, what is the part number for the outside trim of a 6K lock? They're referring to this document. Now, they're certainly happy to help in my experience, most happy, but they're literally referring to the document that's right here, and it would be worth your time to cut out the middleman, so to speak. And you'll be able to find parts. Here we are. Outside trim of a 6K lock storeroom, part 8. Okay, in seconds we found that part number on pages 2-19. Here we are. Here are your part numbers. A2 and A4 keys system training manual. I would very much recommend that you review this document only if you are interested to learn how to combinate small format cores. If you want to learn how to combinate them, everything that you need to learn it is in this document, and also summarized by there's another document that I'm looking for. Best Core and Key Service Manual. That's a service manual on the tools that you would use. Your capping press, your combinator, your kit. So that's helpful to know. You'll obviously need to know that as well. Here it is. Quick reference to combinating best cores. This document actually has all of the information you need. It doesn't tell you why you need the information, but gives you the information. And you can ultimately be able to do this using all of these documents and combinate your cores. In an A2 system, there's A2, A3, and A4. In an A2 system, your your total stack height has to be 23. You'll have a change key, you'll have a control key, you may have a master key or master keys. And it's really straightforward to combinate this material once you've studied it. I would recommend some of the tools because it makes life a lot easier, especially especially having a capping block. You don't need the capping press unless you do a lot of best cylinders. I don't think you need the capping press, but you're going to need this capping block, which when you buy a combinating kit, a pin kit, it's going to be included in that. So I would recommend reviewing that. Okay, we have pretty much exhausted this best cylinder. Let's wrap up this video. In conclusion, I'm very partial to best, and I can tell you that I'm partial to any manufacturer who has exceptional technical support, and they do. You know, exceptional technical support is a way of life nowadays. You have to have it, in my opinion. But they're really good. They're conscientious, is what they are. I called Best earlier today to discuss with them the philosophy that they use when it comes to sizing these the lengths of cylinders and why they do it differently than everyone else. And the tech support person I spoke to could not answer the question. He says, I never thought of it, but was going to find out why and get back to me. And the fact that there's a conscientious follow-up is what puts them into a category of not very many lock manufacturers who do follow up, and they do a great job. Any questions on the Best? This is their 1E74, C181, RP5 622, or any other Best product. Please feel free to reach out to us, and thank you. Again, thank you for watching, and if you've enjoyed this video, please click thumbs up. Please subscribe and maybe even send the video to someone that you know. Thank you.